Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal amid the heavy veil of mourning that had descended over Port Charles, the unexpected death of Natalia struck the community like a thunderclap, rippling through every corner of the city with devastating force. But nowhere did the tragedy hit harder than within the heart of Marco. For a man once known for his resilience, his stoic silence, and his ability to remain untouched by the chaos spun by figures like Sonny and Sidwell, the loss of his mother was not merely a personal grief, it was a complete annihilation of the emotional foundation upon which he had built his life. The woman who had once cradled him through fevered nights, who had shielded him from the world's brutality with nothing more than love and instinct, was now lying still, cold, and silent, and the void she left behind was not just emotional, it was existential. Marco's cries in the hospital room where Natalia's lifeless body rested were not just those of sorrow, but of a soul unraveling. Each tear carved open wounds that bled not just sadness, but fury, confusion, and above all, the paralyzing sense of powerlessness that comes from knowing something is terribly wrong but being unable to prove it. Everyone around him whispered plausible conclusions: accidental overdose, stress-induced collapse, perhaps even suicide. But to Marco, those were cowardly narratives crafted to sweep away the uncomfortable truth. His instincts screamed that this was murder, methodically disguised beneath a veil of medical reports and deflected suspicions. The last known fact, that Natalia had gone to find Sonny just before her death, only deepened the gravity of his suspicion. Sonny, with his tangled history of enemies, backdoor dealings, and emotional manipulations, was a man of many secrets. And to Marco, there was no question that one of those secrets had just claimed his mother's life. The Port Charles Police Department launched its investigation with due diligence, but bureaucracy moved at a pace too slow for a grieving son consumed by desperation. Marco couldn't afford to wait for answers filtered through red tape. Driven by the raw fuel of grief, he embarked on a personal crusade to uncover the truth. He began by acquiring the surveillance footage from the hotel where Natalia had last been seen alive. Though grainy and nearly unusable, one frame showed a shadowy figure. Recognized by Marco immediately as one of Sonny's known enforcers, lurking near Natalia's room shortly before her demise. It was enough to validate his instincts, enough to push him further into obsession. He started tracking every move made by Jason and Sonny, keeping detailed notes on their meetings, their interactions, and even their apparent silences. Every thread, no matter how thin, was pulled. But as Marco plunged deeper into this personal investigation, another presence re-emerged on the chessboard: Sidwell. Once married to Natalia in what had ended as a bitter and fractured union, Sidwell returned to the narrative cloaked in the garb of a grieving ex-husband and devastated father. He arrived at the hospital as soon as he received word of Natalia's death, embracing Marco with all the theatrics of sorrow. His eyes brimmed with tears, his voice broke with anguish, and his entire posture mimicked the collapse of a man destroyed by loss. To the outside world, it was a father reunited in tragedy with his son. But beneath that facade lay the cold, manipulative mind of a man playing a longer, more dangerous game. For what the public did not know, what even Marco had not yet discovered, was that Sidwell had found Natalia's suicide letter, the one she had written in case anything ever happened to her. In that letter, Natalia had not only chronicled her reasons for seeking out Sonny but had also exonerated him of any ill intent. She had expressed her fear of being followed, her sense that someone was trying to silence her, and her hope that by confronting Sonny, she might finally bring an end to a cycle of fear that had plagued her for years. That letter, which could have cleared Sonny and redirected the investigation, never made it to the authorities. Instead, Sidwell burned it. He stood over the flames as Natalia's final truth curled into ash, smiling as the last remnants of her voice were destroyed. Sidwell was never grieving. He was calculating. The death of Natalia, whether by design or by opportunity, was a moment he seized to orchestrate a symphony of vengeance. And the instrument he intended to play most skillfully was Marco. With the delicate touch of a master manipulator, Sidwell began planting subtle ideas in Marco's grief-ridden mind. Affirming his suspicions, guiding his rage, and deepening his conviction that Sonny had orchestrated the murder. He never directly accused, but always suggested. He never confirmed, but always implied. And Marco, emotionally shattered and desperately needing someone to blame, clung to those insinuations like a drowning man to driftwood. The transformation was swift and unsettling. Marco's investigation, once rooted in grief, became a mission of vengeance. He stopped seeking justice and started seeking punishment. He became erratic, volatile, consumed with the idea that destroying Sunny was the only way to restore meaning to his mother's death. Sidwell watched this descent with satisfaction, tightening his grip on Marco by offering resources, contacts in the press, unnamed investigators, legal counsel willing to operate in shadows. Each gift came with no strings, at least none Marco could see, but every act of support was another chain wrapped around his son's psyche. What made the betrayal all the more sinister was how effectively Sidwell weaponized fatherhood. He presented himself not as a puppet master but as a broken man, bonding with Marco through grief, sharing invented memories of a happier marriage with Natalia, even lying about his efforts to get her into rehab. He painted Sunny as a figure of endless corruption and himself as the only man left who cared about truth. Marco, in his vulnerability, absorbed these half-truths and fabrications until they became indistinguishable from memory. Each passing day pushed him further away from the possibility of objectivity and closer to becoming a tool in Sidwell's grand vendetta. In the eyes of the public, Marco remained the sorrowful son, the tragic hero. But behind the scenes, he was being reshaped into something else entirely, something darker, more dangerous, and increasingly unpredictable. His vendetta was no longer about mourning Natalia, but about honoring her through vengeance. Yet the bitter irony remained: the very man he trusted to guide him, the man whose grief mirrored his own, was the one who had silenced Natalia's final truth and weaponized her death. Port Charles, still shrouded in collective grief, had no idea how close it stood to another explosion, not of bombs or bullets, but of betrayal, deception, and the merciless consumption of a son's soul by a father's ambition. And as Marco continued down his self-destructive path, the city braced unknowingly for a reckoning that would shake every foundation it had left. Marco, blinded by grief and spiraling into despair, had no idea he had become nothing more than a pawn in Sidwell's meticulously orchestrated game of revenge. Once a man anchored by empathy, clarity, and the quiet strength instilled in him by Natalia, Marco was now unraveling at the seams, consumed by an obsessive thirst for justice that had already begun to rot into vengeance. As the pain clawed at him from the inside out, he distanced himself from those who might have been able to bring him back from the brink: Lucas, who had once offered him emotional grounding, and Anna, who had quietly tried to involve him in the official investigation without compromising his well-being. Marco refused their help, believing that no one could understand the depth of what he had lost, and worse, suspecting that even those who claimed to care were too hesitant to act decisively against the man he had already judged guilty, Sunny. Abandoning human connection, Marco plunged into an increasingly isolated world of shadows and speculation. He locked himself away for hours at a time, poring over stacks of medical records, archived witness statements, and snippets of security camera footage that most would have dismissed as inconsequential. To him, each frame, each inconsistency in a timeline, each whisper of movement held potential truth. He scoured electronic medical logs from General Hospital, studied the schedules of staff and orderlies who had access to Natalia's room, and interviewed unofficial witnesses. People who were willing to say whatever Sidwell needed them to, so long as they received a quiet threat or a tempting promise. Sidwell, ever present in the background, whispered poison in Marco's ear through carefully selected messengers, reinforcing the illusion that Marco was getting closer to the truth, when in fact he was being led further from it. What Marco didn't see was how his quest, initially born of anguish, had twisted into something Sidwell could mold. Every time Marco came close to a revelation that might absolve Sunny or muddy the clarity of his vendetta, Sidwell would intervene subtly, shifting a piece of evidence, reinterpreting a timeline, or undermining a connection. And Marco, already emotionally frayed, took the bait every time. Slowly, the values Natalia had spent a lifetime cultivating in him, the ability to distinguish right from wrong, to show compassion in the face of chaos, and to remain resilient even when shattered, were fading. In their place grew something harsher, something vengeful, something unrecognizable. To Marco now, Sonny was not just the man indirectly connected to Natalia's death. He had become the embodiment of all the injustice Marco had ever witnessed, every unpunished sin, every moment he had felt powerless. Meanwhile, across town, Jason fought to keep Sonny from tipping into an emotional abyss. Their conversation at the Corinthos estate was fraught with tension, the kind that made the air feel heavier than it should. Jason pleaded for rationality, reminding Sonny that Marco had saved Christina's life during the bombing at Charlie's pub. But Sonny, whose own guilt, fear, and fury were beginning to merge into something volatile, could see only irony in the situation. That the son of his enemy had saved his daughter while he now stood accused of killing that same boy's mother felt like the cruelest twist of fate. To Sonny, the lines were no longer blurry, they were blood-red and permanent. His decision was made, the war had begun, and Marco, whether he deserved it or not, was no longer innocent. In Sonny's mind, retribution did not require the approval of a courtroom, it required swift action, and Marco had made himself a target. But Marco, unaware that the hunter had become the hunted, continued forward with a terrifying resolve. No longer a grieving son, he had transformed into a detective, a prosecutor, and an executioner rolled into one. Utilizing his deep knowledge of General Hospital's internal systems, he accessed drug logs, traced prescription anomalies, and uncovered a disturbing trail of inconsistencies. In Natalia's file, he found medication entries that didn't align with standard treatment protocols. Unfamiliar compounds, incorrect dosages, and undocumented adjustments made in the hours before her death. He identified the janitor who had been on duty the morning Natalia was found and discovered a suspicious 2-hour gap in his schedule. Marco began tailing the man after hours, noting who he spoke to, where he went, what he avoided. Every observation was documented, filed, analyzed. He compiled it all into a massive dossier labeled, "Justice for My Mother," each page a testament to his descent into obsession. But what Marco did not realize, what he could not realize, was that this entire investigation, every data point, every hunch he chased, had been subtly choreographed by Sidwell. The man who pretended to be grieving, who pretended to mourn, was in truth the puppet master behind the curtain. He had seeded the irregularities Marco found, paid off hospital staff to alter records just enough to stoke suspicion, and redirected Marco's focus every time he got too close to uncovering something that might implicate someone other than Sonny. Sidwell had effectively turned Marco into a weapon, a blade forged in grief and sharpened with lies, and pointed that blade straight at Sonny Corinthos. Each passing day drew Marco deeper into the delusion. He began to isolate himself from anyone who questioned his narrative. When Lucas gently urged him to consider other possibilities, Marco accused him of betrayal. When Anna pressed for official cooperation, Marco dismissed her as being on Sonny's payroll. Even Christina's public statements of gratitude were, in Marco's twisted logic, interpreted as manipulation, another layer of Sonny's influence infecting the city. His mental state was deteriorating, but because it was cloaked in the language of purpose and justice, no one could reach him. He truly believed he was the only one left capable of uncovering the truth. And yet, the truth was a shifting illusion, always just out of reach, because the man guiding him had no intention of letting him find it. Sidwell's endgame was not justice for Natalia, but the complete destruction of Sonny. And Marco was merely the most tragic, most effective tool in achieving it. As the days wore on and the storm clouds over Port Charles grew darker, the city stood on the edge of an invisible cliff, blind to the inevitable plunge that Marco's path was leading them all toward. And at the center of it all, caught between a memory and a lie, Marco Rios marched onward, unaware that with every step forward, he was walking deeper into the trap that would one day cost him everything. At the sprawling, historic Courtemain estate, where generations of legacy and pride were etched into every gilded frame and mahogany-paneled wall, a storm had begun to take root, one not of wind and rain, but of dread, calculation, and cold fury. Tracy had always been a woman of foresight, the kind who saw beyond emotion and into the mechanics of consequence. She had watched Port Charles weather countless upheavals, mob wars, corporate takeovers, even Quatermain family implosions. But what now loomed in the wake of Natalya's death was unlike anything she had faced before. Sunny's financial entanglement with deception, once merely an irritation to her, had now transformed into something monstrous, something threatening not only her family's business but the very soul of the Quatermain dynasty. Natalya's death was the catalyst, yes, but it was more than grief that fueled Tracy's growing determination. It was the realization that Sunny's influence, once relegated to back alleys and whispered threats, had now seeped into the boardrooms, into the branding of the very products her family helped create, and into the lives of people she could not afford to lose, including Giovanni. She had tolerated Joe's tenuous connection to Sunny for too long, believing the boy's passions would lead him elsewhere. But in the weeks since Natalya's death, Tracy had observed a shift in him. Subtle at first, then unmistakable. He was quieter. Distant. Less engaged. As if he, too, was being pulled toward the gravitational force that surrounded Sunny, toward the chaos, toward the darkness. So she acted. Without fanfare, without permission. Tracy initiated a full audit of Deception's investors, seeking out shell corporations, offshore accounts, anything she could use to sever Sunny's grip. She quietly removed Gio from social calendars that would place him within Sunny's sphere of influence and began reaching out to legal counsel to explore guardianship options under the guise of protecting family interests. To the outside world, she was just an overbearing matriarch. But behind closed doors, Tracy was launching a preemptive war. And her battlefield wasn't the streets of Port Charles. It was in the courtrooms, the financial ledgers, and the inheritance laws that she knew better than anyone else. While Tracy fortified her defenses, across town at a modest cafe where the scent of espresso barely masked the tension in the air, Emma sat across from Gio, her eyes searching his for signs of life. She had known him long enough to recognize the warning signs, the slow unraveling that came when someone was haunted by more than they could explain. Gio hadn't just lost his aunt. He had lost the innocence that once defined him. He stared past her, absently stirring a cup of untouched tea, as if waiting for the moment he would finally give himself permission to disappear. Emma, never one to stand idly by, tried every tactic, humor, nostalgia, dreams of the future, but nothing pierced the fog. She spoke of the fall semester, of returning to campus and starting over, of music recitals and gallery walks. But Gio, once electrified by the possibilities of creation, now looked at the world like it was a script he no longer wished to read. What neither of them realized was that Gio stood at the precipice of being devoured by two parallel battles, one waged within his family, and the other erupting across the very city they called home. Emma believed she was pulling him back from a ledge, but in truth, she was sitting with someone who had already begun to fall. Outside Charlie's pub, the site of the bombing that had shattered so many lives, the air remained thick with unresolved anguish. Jocelyn stood with Vaughn, her boots planted firmly in the rubble, as if daring the ghosts of that night to confront her. She hadn't come to mourn. She had come to map out her war. With her allegiance to the WSB deepening, Jocelyn no longer saw herself as a citizen of Port Charles but as its necessary purifier. She believed the city had grown too comfortable with corruption, too tolerant of men like Sunny. And now, with Natalia's death still echoing in every whispered conversation and fearful glance, she saw her opportunity. Together with Vaughn, whose intentions remained as enigmatic as his sudden arrival in the city, Jocelyn drafted plans, unofficial channels, off-the-book surveillance, coded messages routed through secure lines. They had no official mandate, but they had conviction. Vaughn fed her just enough information to validate her suspicions, enough to weaponize her grief over the explosion and her hatred for the man she once called family. Every mission they launched from that shattered ground was done in silence, but the ripples spread outward in ways they could not fully control. What Jocelyn didn't know, what Vaughn likely suspected, was that they were not the only ones plotting. Because Marco, once a man of reason and compassion, had already passed the point of no return. While Tracy protected her dynasty, while Emma tried to rescue Gio, while Jocelyn lit her torches of justice, Marco was preparing to light a match and watch the whole city burn. He operated from the shadows now, unrecognizable even to those who once knew him best. His investigation had ballooned into something all-consuming. He now had walls covered in photographs, time stamps, threads of red string mapping out connections, alliances, betrayals. Each new inconsistency he uncovered became gospel. Each loose end was proof of conspiracy. And every breath he took was a step closer to retribution. But what made the coming explosion inevitable was not just Marco's rage, it was the truth he didn't know. That Sidwell, the man he now viewed as his only ally, had been the architect of this entire descent. That the love he believed he was honoring was being perverted into a weapon forged for a decades-long vendetta.